The territory, endless dust, and scattered settlements where law meant whatever the men with badges decided it. Meant a woman knelt in the dirt, her small frame positioned between four armed deputies and a bleeding Apache warrior. She had no weapon, no authority, no reason to believe she would survive the next 5 minutes, but when the sun set that day, she was still breathing, and when it rose again, 176 Apache warriors would be standing outside her cabin. What she didn't know yet was that the number wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Well, Brennan had been hanging laundry when she heard the horses for riders moving fast, dragging something through the dust behind them. She'd learned long ago that when deputies rode hard into the empty spaces between settlements, they weren't coming to help anyone. Her hands stilled on the wet fabric, water dripping onto the cracked earth around her bare feet. The cabin stood alone here, a day's ride from the nearest town, which was exactly why she'd chosen it after her husband died. No neighbors meant no questions meant no pity. The deputies reined their horses to a halt 30 feet from her fence line, and she saw what they'd been dragging a young man, Apache, by his clothing and the long black hair matted with blood. They tied a rope around his chest and pulled him behind the horses like hunters would drag a deer carcass. His face was swollen, one eye completely shut, and he wasn't moving. The deputy in the lead, a thick shoulder man with a dusty coat and a star pin too. His chest swung down from his saddle. "You see this?" he called to her, his voice carrying easy authority. "You see what happens when they come sniffing around where they don't belong?" Will said nothing. Her fingers gripped the wet shirt in her hands, knuckles white, but her face remained carefully neutral. She'd survived 3 years alone out here by knowing when to speak and when silence was the only safety. The deputy she now recognized as Vernon Catch walked closer to the prone figure and kicked him in the ribs. The young Apache didn't react, couldn't maybe found him trying to steal a horse from the Brennan ranch. Catch continued, then paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her more carefully. "Wait, you're the Brennan widow, aren't you?" He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Well, ma'am, we've saved you the trouble of dealing with this thief yourself." The lie was so casual, it almost sounded rehearsed. Willa knew every horse on her late husband's old property. She'd sold them all 2 years ago. There were no horses to steal, and she recognized something else, too, something that made her stomach turn cold. The young man's hands weren't bound, his weapons weren't on him, but there were no weapons nearby. Either they'd stripped him, beaten him, and dragged him to the middle of nowhere for sport. Catch kicked the Apache again, harder this time, a wet, ugly sound, still no movement. "He dead yet?" one of the other deputies asked, a younger man with nervous energy. "Not quite," Catch said. He pulled his pistol from its holster, checked the cylinder with casual efficiency. "Guess we'll finish it proper, Ike." Willa's body moved. Before her mind caught up, she dropped the wet shirt and stepped off her porch, walking directly toward the deputies. Her legs felt strange, disconnected, like they belonged to someone braver. Vernon Catch looked up in surprise as she crossed the distance between them and knelt in the dust beside the Apache, placing her body between him and the gun. "No," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, but it came out. The 4 deputies stared at her like she'd grown a second head. The silence stretched so long she could hear the wind moving through the dry grass beyond her fence. Vernon Catch's face shifted from surprise to something darker. "You got any idea what you just did, woman?" She did. She knew exactly what she'd done, but the young man beneath her was still breathing, shallow and wet sounding. And if she moved now, he wouldn't be breathing much longer. So she stayed there, kneeling in the dirt with her heart hammering so hard. She thought they could probably see it through her worn cotton blouse. And she didn't answer because there was nothing to say that would make this better. Catch holstered his pistol slowly, his jaw working like he was chewing something tough. Then he looked at his men and jerked his head toward their horses. They mounted up without a word, well trained in reading their leader's moods. But before he climbed into his own saddle, Catch walked close enough that Willa could smell the whiskey on his breath. "We'll remember this," he said quietly. "We'll remember you chose." His side. Then they rode off, leaving her kneeling there in the dust beside a dying stranger, wondering what she just brought down on herself, and not knowing that before the next sunrise, the answer would arrive. 176 strong, the Apache didn't wake when she dragged him inside. Willa got her, arms under his shoulders, and pulled, her boots scraping against the wooden floor, leaving a trail of disturbed dust and dry blood. He was heavier than he looked, all lean muscle and dead weight. She managed to get him onto the narrow bed in the corner, the same bed where her husband had died 3 winters ago. The frame creaked under the new weight, a sound she hadn't heard in so long it felt like hearing a ghost speak. His breathing came in shallow, rattling pulls. She'd heard that sound before when her husband's horse had rolled on him and crushed his ribs. He'd lasted 2 days making that exact noise before his lungs filled with fluid and he drowned on dry land. This young man had maybe less time than that. Will pumped water into her basin, the handle squeaking with each stroke. Her hand shook as she wrung out a cloth and started cleaning the blood from his face. The split above his eye would need stitching. 3 of his ribs felt wrong. When she pressed gently against his side, giving where they shouldn't, his right shoulder had been wrenched backward, probably for being dragged by the rope, and there were boot prints, actual boot prints, bruised into his skin, across his stomach and back. She worked through the afternoon and into evening, doing what she could with the limited supplies she had. Thread meant for mending clothes became sutures. Strips torn from an old sheet became bandages. A wooden spoon wrapped in fabric became a splint for 2 fingers on his left hand that bent at angles. Fingers shouldn't bend. The whole time she kept looking toward the door, expecting to hear horses returning. Vernon catches. Words circled in her head like vultures. "Well, remember you chose his side, man." Like Catch didn't make empty threats. They made examples, and she'd made herself an example the moment she put her body between his gun and this stranger. As darkness fell, she lit a single candle and positioned it on the table away from the window. No sense advertising that she was still awake. The Apache's breathing had settled. Somewhat less rattling, more steady. That was something. She sat in the chair beside the bed, her rifle across her lap. She'd never fired it at a person before, but she'd killed plenty of rabbits and 2 coyotes. She told herself a man wasn't much different if it came to that. She told herself she could do it if she had to. The night stretched long and quiet except for the occasional pop of the candle and the sound of his breathing. Around midnight, she noticed his eyes had opened, just barely, the one that wasn't swollen shut. He was looking at her, or trying to. She couldn't read the expression there, fear maybe, or confusion about why he was alive and indoors instead of dead in the dirt. "You're safe," she said, quietly, though she had no idea if that was true. "They're gone." He blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then his eye closed again and his breathing deepened. Not unconscious, she realized, just conserving strength. Smart. She must have dozed sometime before dawn, because she woke to find the candle had burned down to a stub and pale light was coming through the gaps in the walls. Her neck ached from sleeping upright in the chair. The Apache was still breathing, still unconscious or pretending to be. That was good. Every hour he survived improved his chances. Willis stood, her joints protesting, and walked to the window. She needed to check the fence line, needed to feed the chicken she kept behind the cabin, needed to start her day like any other day, even though nothing about this day would be normal. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. Then she stopped breathing. The valley beyond her cabin had filled with people, not a dozen, not 50, hundreds. They sat on horses, arranged in precise lines that seemed to stretch back forever into the morning haze. Warriors with painted faces and traditional dress, women on horseback holding children, elders watching her with expressions she couldn't decipher. And at the front, a man wearing a ceremonial headdress sat motionless on a black horse, his eyes fixed directly on her door. Willa's rifle slipped from her numb fingers and clattered against the porchwood. She couldn't count them all. There were too many, but her mind tried anyway, numbering them in desperate rows. 100 more, many more, the man with the headdress raised one hand, not in threat, just acknowledgement he'd seen her see them, and Willa understood with sudden crystalline clarity that whatever was about to happen next, there was no running from it, no hiding, no pretending she hadn't made the choice she'd made yesterday. The answer to Vernon Catch's question had arrived. They'd all come to answer it. Time moved strangely when you were certain you were about to die. Willa couldn't tell if she'd been standing there for seconds or minutes, frozen on her porch while hundreds of Apache warriors watched her in absolute silence. The only sound was wind moving through the valley and the occasional shift of a horse's weight. No one spoke. No one moved forward. They just waited. The man with the headdress finally dismounted. His movements were deliberate, careful not to seem aggressive. Two other men dismounted with him, flanking him on either side. All three walked toward her cabin with measured steps, their hands visible and empty of weapons. Willa's throat had gone so dry she couldn't have spoken if she'd wanted to. Her rifle was still on the porch at her feet, but what good would one rifle do against this many people? The thought was almost funny. Almost they stopped 10 feet from her porch. Up close, she could see the man with the headdress was older than she'd first thought, maybe 50, with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes held something she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not quite gratitude, either. Something heavier than both. One of the younger men beside him spoke first, his English careful and accented but clear. The woman who stopped the lawman. You are her, Will's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Yes, the younger man translated. To the leader, who nodded once, his expression unchanged. Then the leader spoke several sentences in his own language, fluid and musical in a way that made Willa realize she'd never actually heard Apache spoken before, only shouted commands and curses from men like Vernon Catch. He says you have his son inside your house. The translator said the boy they were beating. No is his name. Is he alive? Yes, Willa managed. He's hurt bad, ribs broken, maybe worse, but he's alive. More translation. The leader's face shifted slightly, something that might have been relief or might have been something else entirely. He spoke again, longer this time, gesturing toward the cabin and then back toward the assembled people behind him. He wants to know why you did it. The translator said, why? You stop men with guns when you have no weapons? Why you took his son inside when you don't know our people? Why you risked your own life for someone who means nothing to you? Will looked past them at the sea of faces watching her. Women, children, old men, and young warriors, all of them waiting for her answer. She thought about Vernon Catch's boot crushing into Nako's ribs. She thought about how easy it would have been to stay on her porch to pretend she hadn't seen anything, to let nature take whatever course it was going to take, because it was wrong. She said finally, simple as that. What they were doing was wrong. The translator spoke to the leader. The leader studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he said something short, just a few words. He says, you are either very brave or very foolish. The translator told her, maybe both. Probably both, Willa admitted, and she was surprised to hear something almost like a laugh in her own voice. Hysteria, maybe fear trying to find a way out. The leader stepped forward, and Willa forced herself not to step back. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small, pressed it into her palm before she could refuse. A carved stone, smooth and warm from being carried close to his body. It had markings she didn't recognize, symbols that might have been words or might have been decorative. She looked down at it, confused. A promise, the translator said. He gives you his word. You will not be harmed by any of our people. Not today. Not ever. You protected his son when you had no reason to. He will not forget. Will closed her fingers around the stone. All these people, she said, looking past the three men to the assembled crowd. Why did so many come? The leader understood her question before it was translated. He smiled just barely and spoke directly to her in English. The words heavily accented but unmistakable. So, you know we mean it. Then he gestured toward the cabin, asking permission with his eyes. She nodded and stepped aside. The three men entered to see Nako, and Willow was left standing alone on her porch, holding a carved stone and staring at 176 reasons why a single act of conscience could change everything. But what she didn't know yet was that Vernon Catch had seen the dust cloud from the Apache horses, and he was already riding to gather more deputies, more men with guns who wouldn't care about carved stones or promises. Nakatili stayed inside the cabin for nearly an hour. Willow waited on the porch, watching the assembled people who watched her back. Children had started moving around now, playing quiet games between the horses. Women had dismounted and were spreading blankets on the ground, settling in like they intended to stay a while. The whole scene felt surreal, like something from a fever dream, except she was awake, and the morning sun was heating the back of her neck, and everything was painfully, impossibly real. When the three men finally emerged, Nakatili's face had changed, not softer exactly, but less stone-like. He spoke to the translator, who turned to Willa. Your medicine work is good. His breathing is better. The bleeding inside has stopped. The young man paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. My father wants you to understand something. When those lawmen took Nako, they were not arresting him. They were going to kill him for sport. They have done this before to our young men who hunt too far from the protection of the group. Willa's stomach turned. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it said plainly made it real in a way that suspicion couldn't. How many times before? 3 times in 2 seasons. 3 young men who did not come home. The translator's voice remained even, but she could see anger tightening the corners of his mouth. We could not prove it. The lawmen say they were shot while committing crimes. They say they found bodies already dead. They lie, and we cannot fight back without starting something that would destroy all our people. So why risk it now? We'll ask, why bring so many people here? If those deputies see this, they'll say you're preparing for battle. Nakatili spoke again, and this time the translator smiled, though it wasn't a happy expression, because they already started the battle when they took his son, because we're tired of pretending their laws apply to them, and because you gave us something we have not had before. What's that? A witness, a white woman, who saw what they did and chose to stop it. The translator gestured at her small frame, her worn dress, the simple cabin. Behind her, you have no wealth, no power, no reason the law would favor you over them, but you chose right over safe. That matters to my father. That matters to all of us. Willow looked down at the carved stone still in her palm. What does this mean? The symbols, it means you are family now, not by blood, but by choice, by action. He pointed at the crowd behind him. You see how many came? 176 people. That is every member of our clan who could ride, the old grandmother who can barely sit a horse, the youngest boy who just learned to stay in the saddle. Every single one. We came to show you that when you protected one of us, you protected all of us, and now we protect you. The weight of that settled on her shoulders like physical pressure. She'd wanted to be left alone. She'd built her life around being invisible, unremarkable, forgotten, and now she had an entire clan of Apache people claiming her as family, which meant Vernon Catch would see her as an enemy to everything he believed about how this territory should work. There's more coming, she said quietly. The deputies, they'll bring others. They'll say you're hostile. They'll use this as an excuse to do exactly what you're trying to prevent. We know, the translator said. We saw the dust from their horses an hour ago. They are gathering at the settlement to the east. Maybe 10 men now, maybe more by afternoon. Then you should go take Nako and leave before they get here. I'll tell them he died during the night. I'll tell them anything they want to hear. Nakatili understood her words before the translation finished. He shook his head firmly and spoke at length, his voice carrying a finality that needed no interpretation. The translator turned to her. He says, we do not abandon family. He says, if the lawmen want to start something here, we will finish it. And he says, you will not face them alone, not ever again. Inside the cabin, she heard movement, A groan, then a weak cough. Nako was waking up. Properly this time, Nakatili moved immediately toward the door, but he paused at the threshold and looked back. At Willa, he said something in his own language, soft and serious. He thanks you, the translator said, for his son's life, for your courage, for choosing truth when lies would have been safer. Then he went inside, and Willow was left standing in the morning light, holding a stone promise and watching the eastern horizon where dust was rising. More horses, more men with badges and guns, and certainty that they were in the right. And she realized with sudden clarity that this day was far from over. They came in the early afternoon when the sun was at its highest and offered no shade. 9 riders this time. Vernon. Catch leading them in a tight formation that spoke of military training, or at least military pretension. They stopped. At the edge of Willa's property line, their horses stamping and blowing from the hard ride. Catch's eyes swept across the scene before him, taking in the assembled Apache, the organized camps, the obvious fact that this wasn't a raiding party, but something else entirely. Well, he said, loud enough to carry across the open ground. Looks like the widows made some new friends. Will stood on her porch with Nakatili beside her, the translator one step behind. The carved stone felt hot in her pocket, as if it were absorbing the afternoon heat and concentrating at her. Mouth had gone dry again, but she forced herself to stand straight, to not show the fear that was making her hands want to shake. She's under our protection now, the translator called out. The boy you try to kill is inside healing. If you have come for him, you will have to come through all of us. One of the deputies, a younger man Willa didn't recognize, shifted nervously in his saddle. That's a lot of them, Vernon. I can count. Catch snapped, then louder, addressing the translator directly. That boy is a criminal suspect. We have authority to take him into custody. You're interfering with the law. What law? The translator shot back. The law that lets you drag our young men behind horses until they are dead. The law that says you can beat someone senseless and call it justice. Show us the warrant. Show us the crime. Catch his jaw tightened. Don't need to show you anything. This is our territory governed by our rules. You want to make this into something bigger than it needs to be. That's your choice, but it won't end well for any of you. Nakatili spoke then, his voice carrying despite the language barrier. He didn't need translation for the deputies to understand the tone. This was not a man who would be moved by threats. The translator relayed his words. He says, you have 2 choices. You can ride away now and admit you have no legal standing here, or you can try to take the boy by force and we will defend him, but no. This, if you choose force, every person here is a witness to what you really are, not lawmen, just killers hiding behind badges. The standoff stretched across seconds that felt like hours. Willow watched Catch's face, saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. 9 men against nearly 200, even with guns, even with badges, even with whatever sense of righteous authority he'd built his identity around. The math was clear, and more than that, there were witnesses now, white witnesses, among his own deputies, men who might start asking questions about what really happened yesterday, if this turned violent. This isn't over, Catch said finally. His horse danced sideways. Sensing his tension, we'll be back with proper authority, federal marshals, the army. If we have to, you want to protect a thief and make an enemy of the law. That blood's on your hands. The only blood here is the blood you spilled, the translator said evenly. And everyone knows it now. Catch wheeled his horse around with more force than necessary, jerking the reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head. His deputies followed, some of them looking back over their shoulders at the assembled Apache with expressions that were hard to read. Fear maybe, or uncertainty, or just the realization that the story they'd been told about how things worked out here didn't match what they were seeing with their own eyes. When the dust from their departure had settled, Nakatili turned to Willa and spoke quietly. The translator provided the words, they will be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but men like that do not forget being challenged. You understand this? I do. Willa said, and she did. She'd understood it from the moment she'd knelt in the dirt beside Nako. Some choices you couldn't take back, and some consequences you just had to live with. Then you understand you are not alone in facing them. Nakatili said through the translator, "You gave my son his life back. We'll make sure you do not lose yours for that choice." Inside the cabin, Nako called out weakly, asking for water. Willow went to help him, and through the open door, she could see the Apache people beginning to break camp too, prepare for the journey back to their own territory. But several of the warriors were staying, she noticed, setting up a more permanent watch around her property. The protection wasn't symbolic anymore. It was real, and it was going to have to be because Vernon Catch wasn't done with her, not by a long measure. 3 days passed before Nako could sit up without his face going pale from pain. Will change his bandages twice daily, watching the wounds begin. The slow work of healing, the swelling around his eye had gone down enough that he could open it now, and the rattling sound in his breathing had faded to something more normal. His ribs would take longer, weeks probably, but he was past the immediate danger. The Apache warriors who'd stayed behind had built a simple camp 50 yards from her cabin. 6 of them, rotating watch duties, making sure no one approached without being seen first. They kept their distance, respectful of her space, but their presence changed everything about how she moved through her days. She wasn't alone anymore, and that feeling was both comforting and deeply strange after 3 years of solitude. On the 4th morning, Nako spoke to her for the first time in English. His voice came out rough from disuse and injury, but the words were clear enough. "Thank you." Will looked up from the pot she was stirring on the stove. "You speak English some?" "My father wanted me to learn. Said it was important to understand the words of people who make promises and break them." He shifted carefully on the bed, wincing as his ribs protested the movement. "You kept your promise. You did not have to." "I didn't make any promise," she said. "Yes, you did. When you put yourself between me and those men, that was a promise." He touched his chest gently right over where his ribs had been kicked in. "You said this life matters. You said it without words, but you said it." Willa turned back to the pot, not sure how to respond to that. She ladled out some thin soup and brought it to him, helping him sit up enough to eat without choking. His hands shook from weakness, but he managed to get the food down. "The one who did this," Nako said. "After he'd eaten Vernon Catch, he will not stop. He does not know how to stop." Men like him see the world as something they own, and when someone challenges that, they become dangerous in new ways. "I know," Willis said quietly. "I've known men like him before. Your husband." She blinked, surprised by the question. "No, my husband was kind, too kind. Maybe he trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. But no, not him." She sat down in the chair beside the bed. "My father was like Catch, though. Believe the world owed him obedience just because he wanted it. Beat my mother when she didn't agree fast enough. Beat me when I spoke against him. Is that why you live alone out here?" "Part of it." He died angry, wondering why none of his children came to his funeral. "And my husband died in an accident that maybe wasn't as accidental as people said." She hadn't talked about this in years, hadn't let herself think about it. The horse that rolled on him had been spooked by something, we never found out what, but there were men he'd argued with a week before, men who didn't like that he treated their workers fair. Nako nodded slowly, understanding more than what she'd said aloud. "So you know what is to be powerless against people who have power?" "Yes, and you still stepped in, even knowing what it would cost." Willow looked down at her hands, rough and callous from work. "I could not do it. Does that make sense?" Standing there watching would have been worse than whatever happens to me, because I stopped it. "It makes sense to me," Nako said. "It makes sense to my father and to everyone who came here. That is why they call you family now, not because of blood, but because you understand what family means. You protect the ones who cannot protect themselves outside." One of the warriors called out a warning. Horses approaching from the east. Willa's heart jumped, expecting Vernon Catch returned with reinforcements. But when she went to the door, she saw different riders, 3 men, one wearing a silver badge that caught the afternoon light differently than the tin stars the deputies wore. The other two looked harder, more professional, their hands resting easy near their weapons in a way that spoke of real experience rather than borrowed authority. The man with the silver badge stopped his horse at the property line and called out to the Apache warriors first, showing respect in the gesture. Then he looked toward the cabin. I'm Marshal James Garrett, Territorial Marshal. I'm here to investigate claims of assault and unlawful detention of a suspect. I'd like to speak with the woman who lives here and with the young man who was allegedly attacked. Willa stepped onto the porch. I'm Willa Brennan. This is my property, and yes, you can speak with us. Both, but the men who attacked him are the ones you should be investigating. Marshal Garrett dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Ma'am, that's exactly what I intend to do. Deputy Catch sent word requesting federal intervention, but his story has some gaps that need filling. I understand you were there when the incident occurred. Willis said, and I saw everything. The marshal nodded. Then let's start from the beginning, and this time, let's make sure the truth is the only thing that gets written down. Marshal Garrett sat up at the small table inside Willa's cabin, spreading out papers and pulling a pencil from his vest pocket. His two deputies remained outside with the Apache warriors, a tense but civil arrangement that spoke to the marshal's experience in handling situations that could explode into violence if handled poorly. Nakatili came inside to stand beside his son, and the translator positioned himself where he could relay everything clearly. Before we begin, Garrett said, looking directly at Willa, I want you to understand something. What you tell me will be written down and used as official testimony. If you lie to protect anyone, that becomes a crime in itself. If you tell me the truth, even if that truth is complicated, you have my word that I'll investigate it fairly. Understood? Understood. Willa said, good. Now tell me exactly what happened, starting from when you first saw Deputy Catch and his men. Willa took a breath and began. She told him about hanging laundry, hearing the horses, seeing them drag Nako behind like an animal. She described the boot prints she'd seen on his body, the way Vernon Catch had kicked him while he was down, the casual mention of finishing the job. She told him about stepping between the gun and the wounded man, about the threat Catch had made. Before leaving, Garrett wrote it all down, his pencil moving steadily across the paper. When she finished, he looked up. And what reason did Deputy Catch give for the arrest? He said, No, I'd been trying to steal horses from my late husband's ranch, but I sold those horses 2 years ago. There were no horses to steal. The marshal made note of that, so the stated reason for the arrest was demonstrably false. Yes, he turned to Nako next, speaking through the translator. Can you tell me what happened before Deputy Catch found you? Nako's answer came slowly, translated piece by piece. He'd been hunting alone, tracking a deer that had led him farther east than he'd intended to go. He'd stopped at a creek to water his horse. When the 4 deputies appeared, they'd drawn weapons immediately, given no warning, no chance to explain. They'd knocked him from his horse, taken his weapons, and begun the beating. They'd tied the rope around him while he was barely conscious and dragged him for what felt like miles before stopping at Willa's property. Did you resist arrest? Garrett asked. There was no arrest, Nako said through the translator. There were no questions, just violence. They wanted to hurt me, and they did. Garrett wrote that down too, then looked at Nakatili. And you brought your entire clan here because we have lost 3 young men in 2 seasons to these same deputies, Nakatili said, his English emerging carefully. All found dead, all claimed to be criminals, all lies. When we heard Nako was alive because this woman protected him, we came to show that we stand with anyone who chooses truth over lies, justice over convenience. The marshal studied Nakatili for a long moment. 3 men in 2 seasons. Were those deaths reported to any federal authority? No, we were told by local law that our people's word meant nothing against the deputy's report. We were told if we pushed the matter, we would be seen as hostile. So we buried our dead and stayed quiet. The pain in his voice was evident even through the careful pronunciation until this woman showed us that not everyone accepts their lies. Garrett closed his notebook and stood. I need to speak with Deputy Catch and his men separately. Get there. Account of events. But I'll tell you right now, what you've described constitutes assault with intent to kill, abuse of authority, and false imprisonment at minimum. If I can verify even half of what you're claiming, those badges won't protect them. Will you verify it? Well, ask, or will you decide that keeping the peace is easier than pursuing the truth? The marshal looked at her with something that might have been respect. Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 17 years. I've seen good men with badges and bad men with badges. The bad ones count on people being too scared to speak up too, or too convinced that nothing will change anyway. But when someone does speak up, when the truth gets loud enough that ignoring it becomes impossible, that's when change happens. He put his notebook in his pocket. You made the truth loud. Now it's my job to make sure it matters. He left to interview Vernon Catch, and Willa sat down heavily in her chair, suddenly exhausted. Nakatili placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief gesture of solidarity. The hard part is over, he said quietly, but Willa knew better. The hard part was just beginning, because even if Marshal Garrett did everything right, even if justice actually happened for once, she'd made enemies who wouldn't forget, and those enemies wouldn't care about badges or authority or the truth. They'd only care about revenge. Marshal Garrett returned 5 days later with Vernon Catch and his 3 deputies in iron shackles, riding in a wagon with bars. The transformation in Catch was striking. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like disbelief that his world had actually caught up with him. The other deputies looked worse, haunted by whatever consequences were waiting for them at the territorial capital. Ma'am, Garrett said, dismounting at Willa's fence line. Wanted you to see this before we transport them. Figured you'd earned that much. Will stood on her porch with Nako beside her, leaning on a walking stick, but standing on his own now. The ribs were still healing, would be tender for weeks yet, but the immediate danger had passed. His father and several warriors stood nearby, witnesses to this moment. What did you find? Will asked. Everything you said checked out. More than that. Actually, I talked to people in 3 settlements who'd been too afraid to speak up before, found the families of those 3 young Apache men who'd disappeared, got testimony from 2 other deputies who'd been pressured to stay quiet about what they saw. Garrett pulled out an official document, unfolded it. Vernon Catch is charged with attempted murder, abuse of authority, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 3 Apache men. His deputies face similar charges, though 2 of them cooperated fully once they understood the alternative. What's the alternative? Nako asked, his English clearer now after days of practice. Hanging, Garrett said flatly. The territorial judge doesn't take kindly to lawmen who abuse their position, especially when the evidence is this clear. He looked at Vern and Catch in the wagon. They'll be tried in the capital. If convicted, which seems likely given what I've gathered, they'll lose their badges and serve time in the territorial prison. Catch is looking at 20 years minimum. Catch stared at Willow with pure hatred. This is your fault, he spat. You chose them over your own kind. I chose right over wrong, Willis said. Quietly, that's not the same thing as choosing sides. Tell yourself that when they turn on you, tell yourself that when you need help, and no white man will lift a finger because you're a traitor to your race. Marshal Garrett slammed his hand against the wagon bars. That's enough. You don't get to speak anymore. Catch, you lost that privilege when you decided badges meant you could kill whoever you wanted. The wagon rolled away toward the territorial capital, and Willow watched until it disappeared beyond the horizon. The weight she'd been carrying since that first afternoon began to lift, not completely, but enough that she could breathe deeper. It is done, Nakatili said, standing beside her. Justice, real justice, not the kind they usually give our people. It's not over, Willis said. Catch was right about one thing. There will be people who see what I did as betrayal, who won't want to trade with me or help me if I need it then. They're not your people, Nako said. We are your people now. You will not face those consequences alone. 3 months later, Willa's cabin had changed, not the structure itself, which remained small and simple, but the land around it, the Apache warriors who'd stayed as Guards had helped her repair the fence, improve the well, build a proper shelter for the chickens. Nako, fully recovered, now visited twice a week with supplies from his clan, always bringing more than she needed and refusing payment. The isolation she'd once sought had transformed into something else: connection, community, the carved stone. Nakatili had given her sat on her table, where she could see it every morning, a reminder that family wasn't just blood. In marriage, sometimes it was choice, sometimes it was standing between a gun and a stranger, because the alternative was living with yourself afterward. She'd lost some of her old customers, the ones who'd heard about what happened, and decided they couldn't trust a woman who'd sided with the Apache, but she'd gained new ones, too.